Hi, I'm Rachel, and I'm here to do a review of the 3 books that I read for the 2014 Sami Rohr Prize. The Sami Rohr Prize is for emerging Jewish writers who've written their first book, either in fiction or nonfiction, depending on the year. Every year there are 5 contenders, and I pick 3 of the books to read. I've been moving through the backlist. Right now I'm doing nonfiction, and after this I have 1 more year to go. It's taken me longer to get to this than I hoped. I'm trying to squeeze in as what I can before NaNoWriMo tomorrow. So it turns out that I'm making this video just a couple of days after the largest anti-Semitic attack on U.S. soil. So I've been in a little bit of a weird headspace for a while. I don't have any personal connections to Pittsburgh, but the Jewish community being small as it is, I know of people who have connections there. In fact, one man that I worked with a few years ago when I was doing some freelance editing for a magazine, Moment Magazine, he grew up in Squirrel Hill, and now he writes for a DC paper, The Hill, and he recently wrote an editorial about his feelings about what was going on, so I'll link that below. The Jewish media is in Pittsburgh pretty heavily right now, and have been for the past couple of days putting out stories about what this means for the community. And one of the ones that I read from JTA that maybe I shouldn't have was a minute-by-minute accounting of the shooting, and it was just really brutal. I mean, the thing that stuck with me the most is how much the Shabbat services were familiar to me. I mean, just I could imagine everything the shooter saw when he came in. I see it myself whenever I go to Shabbat. I have a pretty similar history in a way to the congregations in Tree of Life Synagogue. There are 3 congregations that worship in that space. One Reconstructionist congregation, and I grew up Reconstructionist, and then 2 conservative Mastori congregations, and I belong now to the largest conservative synagogue in the DC area, and every Shabbat we have several Shabbat services going on, including those catered to toddlers and children, so it hits close to home the way I'm sure that these things do whenever any specific place of worship or community center is attacked. The people who are familiar with that venue would feel the same. So it does feel apropos to resist this bigotry and violence by refusing to downplay my Jewish identity and my love for Judaism, and of course a lot of that takes place on this blog and through reviews like this one of Jewish Book Awards. I'm a small fry booktuber. I don't make much of a splash here on the YouTubes, but I'm grateful for the people who I've met through this endeavor and who comment on my videos, and thank you so much for that. I also have been thinking a lot about trying to reach out to the Jewish literary community, but I haven't really been doing that, and I don't believe there's a whole bunch of Jewish booktubers or people who are interested in Jewish literature. But every now and then somebody leaves a comment on one of these videos, someone interested in Judaism, or often a Jewish person themselves who have read these books or are interested in them, and that always warms my heart, and that's why I'm glad that these will be out there on the internet, because they aren't just here for today, but they'll be here as long as my channel is, so people can stumble upon them when they have the need or the want to reach out for these books, and I hope that they'll find this video helpful. So I thought I'd structure this video concisely. I've had some problems with brevity lately, but I'll see how I do. I'll just hold up the books and say a little bit about what they're about and who might be interested in them. So this is the first book that I read for 2014 Sami Rohr. This is The Genius, Elijah of Vilna and the Making of Modern Judaism by Eliyahu Stern. And this book is somewhat of a revisionist history. Stern is positing that modern Judaism was created by this rabbi rather than by the forces of enlightenment in Europe. So off of the bat, I have to say that this book would have a pretty narrow range of interest. People who are very interested in Jewish history are the only ones I think that would really want to reach for this book. Elijah Vilna, the Gaon, as he was known, which I'm probably maybe mispronouncing, but I know it means genius. He was a famous scholar of the 18th century. He actually had some knowledge of mathematics and philosophy and that sort of thing, but his focus and interest was very strictly on Jewish texts. He was a huge proponent of study, of Torah study and of Talmud study, and seemed to be a bit of a jerk to his family, pretty much always holed up, but he had his agenda, as it were, and he's known in religious circles, I guess, for changing some of the tides of community building, perhaps. He's credited with the resurgence of the yeshiva as a focal point in Orthodox Judaism rather than court, basically. The yeshiva is, I don't know, from what I remember of the book and of what I know of yeshiva, is it's more open-minded, it's about debate, it's a little bit less authoritarian, as it were. For me, that's fascinating because I guess I know enough about Jewish history that it's the next step for me is to have more of an understanding of what medieval to Enlightenment religious thought looks like. And it was fascinating to read about Stern's arguments with like Maimonides. I mean, Maimonides lived several centuries before the Gaon did. I think I said Stern before. But, you know, it's about the ways that religious thought processes and beliefs change, which for me as a progressive Jew is heartening because there's a myth that, you know, Orthodox Judaism is stagnant and that it's exactly the same as it was from when Moses handed down the tablets, or God handed the tablets to Moses on Mount Sinai. And that's not true. Orthodoxy, well, actually a lot of Orthodoxy is a reaction to progressive Judaism, and the tenets of traditional practice, even within that structure, changed a lot too. Everything is constantly evolving. But anyway, I'm getting onto a ramble already. Basically, Stern's argument feels a little bit strained because the Gaon didn't have any intention of confronting Enlightenment or any form of non-Orthodox practice. Stern, it goes on to say that, you know, Zionists and other forms of more modern Judaism take inspiration from him, but he had no intention of getting to that point. His focus was on perfecting our understanding of the holy texts and making them as perfect as they could be. It has nothing to do with more modern movements, and so I think to have made that case, Stern shouldn't have even focused on a biography of the Gaon, but on more modern history, if he wanted to make that point. But be that as it may, this was a fascinating biography for me, but I think it would be a little bit closed off to the casual reader. Next, I read Embodying Hebrew Culture, Aesthetics, Athletics, and Dance in the Jewish Community of Mandate Palestine by Nina S. Spiegel. And this book chronicles 4 events that the Jewish community in British Mandate Palestine in mostly the 20s and the 30s very deliberately put on to try to foist a sense of Israeli culture. And this in itself is fascinating because it goes against how culture is normally formed organically. The Jews who moved to Palestine wanted to create an identity, and so they very intentionally tried to create these forms of sports and dance and so forth. And a lot of that had to do with melding the culture that surrounded the Eastern European Jews in Europe with a sense of biblical and Arabic-inspired sort of Middle Eastern dance and song and etc. And that obviously leads to contention in this Israeli-Palestinian debate, which is always ready to broil over. Not at all helped by the fact that the Eastern European Jews, who made up the majority of the people who created culture and Mandate Palestine, for all of their persecution in Europe, they seem to have picked up a European sense of elitism and racism about Orientalism. That being said, not all Jews were from Eastern Europe, and now Israel is 50% Mizrahi and Sephardi Jews who come from Northern Africa and Middle Eastern countries. So a lot of that inspiration, Middle Eastern inspiration, does come from Middle Eastern Jews. Anyway, this book first talks about a Miss Esther beauty pageant that happened in the 20s for a little while. Esther is the heroine of a Jewish holiday Purim, and in crowning a girl of Mandate Palestine, like their, Queen of the Year, they were trying to set up what their aesthetic beauty was and their aesthetic narrative about what a Jewish girl is in Palestine. And so intriguingly, they did go back and forth between an Ashkenazi to a Yemeni girl, like they had one and then the other and then one and then the other, so that they were sort of seesawing between both of them and trying to meld both of them into a Jewish-Israeli identity. And then we go into the Maccabeah Games, which still go on in Israel. They are sports played between Jewish teams of various countries, and in the beginning, one of the major draws was not only getting Jews from diaspora to play the games, but also to settle in Palestine. They did have an interest in building up the Jewish community there. And then the final two chapters deal with sort of professional dance and then folk dance. And there's a lot of interesting conflicts of interest going on here, certainly from the outside, like, Arabs and also the British were sometimes okay with some of this and sometimes not okay with other parts of this, depending on how they felt about the Jewish community at the time. But within the Jewish community, there was also a bunch of infighting between the religious and secular about, like, appropriate forms of female modesty or lack thereof in a pageant, perhaps, and also between socialist Zionists and more urban Zionists. The urban Zionists tended to be richer and more bourgeois, as it were, and the socialist Zionists were all about the working class, and so they squabbled a whole lot about which class of people was getting venerated, and it seems like particularly they might have been on different sides of the fence when it came to, like, professional bourgeois dance and then folk dance, which was supposed to be for everybody. So there's a lot going on in here in this strange attempt to force culture, as it were, but I feel like, and certainly Spiegel presents all of this with a bit of love and a bit of compassion for the fact that the Jewish narrative is in and of itself rather unusual. The fact that so much of our history was marred by persecution and forced migration. We weren't often able to maintain a sense of identity in other countries, be they in Europe or in the Middle East. And so that the fact that the Jews of Mandate Palestine had to proactively think about this and create all of this is relatively understandable, because for so much of human history, Jews were othered wherever they were. So I think this is a fascinating look into the types of questions that communities might ask themselves when forced with the conundrum of creating a cultural identity. And finally, the last book I read was Jews and Booze, Becoming American in the Age of Prohibition by Marnie Davis. I feel like this is the most accessible book to the widest audience, but this might be very American-centric of me. Most of the Jewish nonfiction books that I've read over this Sami Rohr project have centered on America, and it's sort of my personal fascination, of course, with how Jews defined themselves, particularly in the 19th and early 20th centuries. And this one goes through the lens of prohibition. And certainly after the events recently, it doesn't take a lot for me to believe in some of the cynicism of what's going on and what Davis is saying here, in that the prohibition movement wasn't entirely about concern over alcoholism, but it was about a form of nationalism and about a form of claiming that immigrants, and particularly Jewish immigrants, were other and were un-American. And throughout the chapters of this book, Davis is chronicling the ways that the two major American Jewish groups of the time, the more acculturated German Jewish people who arrived in mid-19th century versus the poorer and less assimilated Russian Jews of the late 19th century and early 20th century, how they interacted with the broader American culture. A whole lot of Jews of both groups turned into merchants, the major difference being that most of the German Jews were merchants for white Protestants, whereas the Russian Jews were merchants for African Americans and other non-Nordic ethnic white groups, and during that time when whiteness was a little bit more malleable for Jews and Irish and Italians. So she goes into saloon owners and brewery owners and how some of the religious folks of the day tried to deal with the rising prohibition movement until ultimately the Volstead Act was passed. She talks a little bit about bootlegging and some of the Jewish mafia members, but not a whole lot into them. She's more interested in the broader Jewish community. She also diverges a little bit into acts of violence against Jews that happened around this time period, directly or indirectly related to America's relationship with alcohol. Because through this book, alcohol is a bastion for the un-American. And it's a rallying cry, particularly for Protestants of the time, to foist the narrative that America was always a Christian state. Another part of this book, and pretty much every book about American history that I have read lately, is that it inadvertently brushes upon the racism in our country and how much black people had been demonized and victimized by white society. And even though Jews are the subject of this book and most of the books I read, racism is just so ingrained, the systematic racism is so ingrained in our history that it always comes up. So it's an interesting avenue to explore how black people were faring during Prohibition as well. So yeah, I'm not sure how much I might be a little too tinged by what's been happening lately to be as objective as I should, but I do feel like this book hits close to home, and she certainly has a lot of research under her belt to make her points. Maybe the thing that makes me raise my eyebrow the most is a completely throwaway line in the conclusion about why she thinks people are interested in Jewish mafia men today, and she says maybe it's because they were loud and proud in their Judaism. They refused to completely assimilate, and they couldn't assimilate really into the broader culture, white culture at that time. I'm not sure if that's entirely true. It reminds me that in this book, Stern posits correctly, I believe, that religious Jews in America can often, and also cultural Jews in America can often tout their Judaism without feeling othered. Well, usually anyway. But I do think there is a difference between Jews who define with religion, be it progressive Judaism or Orthodoxy, versus those who don't, because they often have to grasp a little harder to ask what Judaism is. Often they turn to Holocaust remembrance and Zionism for that. Hopefully they don't turn too often to lionizing members of the mob. You can find links to more information about this Sami Rohr Prize, plus all of my Goodreads reviews for these 3 books, down below. So that about covers it for me now. The irony is not lost on me that I've wrapped up an October nonfiction reading project, and then I intend to pick it back up in December, and I'm completely skipping over November, which is nonfiction reading month here on BookTube. I feel kind of bad about that. It does sound intriguing, but at the same time I'm going to be completely embroiled in NaNoWriMo, and my TBR list is completely short fiction and YA. That's what I think I can handle. But rest assured, I will be back in December to do my final backlist Sami Rohr Prize for 2016. It's been a good nonfiction reading year for me, nonfiction November or not, huzzah! So thanks so much for watching, everyone, and I'll see you next time.